relatively sunny Bergen, from a relatively sunny Bergen, where I'm out here talking to the International Research Ship Operators Conference. So people who operate research infrastructure from around the world. I am going to be brief because actually Alex is the main show here, and then the Q&A is going to be important because that always throws up some stuff. So FMRI is looking at future research infrastructure, and it does aim to be science-led, and the SRF is key to that. It is a very visible sign of that, and it will be used as a live document by the SAG, who advise and inform the programme. FMRI has to balance that against being financially and environmentally sustainable. And just on those 2 points quickly, environmentally sustainable means that the delivery model for the research infrastructure has probably got to change a bit. And we're still exploring how and to what degree, but that is part of what we're trying to do. And then financially sustainable, I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that there isn't a lot of money flowing around at the moment, or certainly not extra money. I'm going to echo what I hear the executive chair of NERC say in this context, which is it means we've got to make better arguments to get a hold of some of the money. And for me, the SRF is a key component of that. It articulates very well why we need to do marine science, why oceanography is important. But what I would encourage everyone who's read the SRF, contributes to the SRF, listens and contributes to this webinar, is to not stop there, but to continue to, either through SAG members or direct into the programme, throw in more advice, tell us more why marine science is important, and engage with the programme in as many ways as you can, because it helps us make that argument more effectively. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and hand over to Alex, but thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Bournemouth, where I'm at the LibDem conference, which is a first for me. Thank you all for joining this morning. I'm going to get straight on with the presentation on the science review framework, and then we can move into questions after that. So let me just get the presentation up. And hopefully you can all see that. Can I just check, Christian, Leigh, can you?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So the UK Science Requirements Framework is an integral part of the Future Marine Research Infrastructure Programme. You can look on it as the kind of evidence base on which future marine research infrastructure bids are constructed. It's meant to be a live document, and so it will be updated in coming years to reflect any changes in the marine science landscape. Okay. Right. Now that my presentation appears to be working, so I thought I'd just start by really putting forward the point that the blue economy is becoming more and more important for society, and particularly in the context of the Labour government, where there is this very strong policy around innovation towards economic activity for UK PLC. This is a very important part of the background to SRF. So the blue economy is projected to grow to $3 trillion to 2030, with some states even predicting growth to 5 trillion. The ocean is looked on as a critical source of food security nutrition, economic growth and well-being of coastal communities. Something like 80% of the direct economic benefits from the ocean are thought to be underpinned by healthy ecosystems. So very much following on from the Dasgupta report here on and natural assets. And one example specific to the UK here is that ocean observations, so marine science, contributes to the blue economy through the offshore wind industry by reducing costs by an estimated 20%, which adds up to about £5 billion. But of course, we're facing a triple planetary crisis at the moment in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss and pollution, which all affect the ocean and which make ensuring that our activities in the ocean are sustainable very critical. And as a result of this increasing reliance on ocean activities and the blue economy, it's really important that we have the science to really underpin the management and sustainability of these activities. This is leading to an increasing complexity of need for observations by society. These are related to sustainable management of exploitation of biotic and abiotic resources, so fisheries and minerals being examples there, conservation and restoration of marine biodiversity and the health of marine ecosystems, and forecasting the ocean, weather, climate and biogeochemistry in terms of mitigation or adaptation to the risks of hazards via early warning systems. So essential ocean variables are extremely important. And as I've just said, these are expanding. And of course, with an expanding need for ocean observations comes an expanding need for marine science and marine science infrastructure. But this is all happening just at a point where we're seeing significant geopolitical changes, which are affecting funding for ocean science, as well as obviously overall economic stress across a number of countries, including our own. Another general point to make here is that our ocean observation systems need to be flexible in terms of the spatial and temporal scales of observations and sampling of the ocean needed. These scales range from microscopic to global and sub-second to multi-decadal. So this is a huge range of scales and obviously requires a range of different sampling technologies and strategies. And also just to remind everyone in the audience that reconstructions of the past ocean states and processes also require proxies that can be applied over timescales of centuries to millions of years. Another cross-cutting theme that's come through very strongly on the SRF project is that of the digital transformation that we have to undergo to really handle the increased data flows that are coming from things like autonomous platforms, and also the needs to make those data accessible and convert those data to knowledge which is useful for stakeholders. And on the right-hand screen side of the screen here is an example of where these modern digital approaches are being used in a real case. This is the Whale Safe project in the Northeast Pacific, where near real-time data from hydroacoustics and on vessel traffic is enabling a live and real-time system for avoiding collisions between whales and vessels transporting goods and so on. And this also includes a naming and shaming system for vessels which, despite the warnings they receive, exceed recommended speeds and so on. So it's a real sort of live case of ocean management arising from real-time and near real-time observations. I'm not going to go into the kind of first section of the science review framework in great detail. There is a lot of material there. It lays out the societal needs for the FMRI programme, the UK's place as an international leader in marine science, the national and international governmental priorities for ocean science, the institutional landscape of marine science in the UK, so covering institutions, HEIs, the whole range of organisations involved in ocean observations. And also it looks at the current portfolio of marine research infrastructure and national marine science programmes, as well as UK leadership or participation in international programmes. And this really lays out the initial part of the science requirements framework, and you can see that outlined in this diagram here, where we look at the societal drivers and stakeholder needs for ocean science, look at the science questions and product requirements, the ocean variable requirements, the EOVs we need to observe, and the kind of key capabilities that science really requires. And following on from the SRF will be an options analysis in the FMRI programme based on these science needs. The second section of the SRF really looks at what we call the grand challenges, so the major areas of marine science that we all work on. The first grand challenge is really looking at the role of the ocean in a changing climate. And the complexity here is that obviously climate change really intersects with every single other area of marine science that we undertake. So it impacts on biodiversity, it impacts on the blue economy, it impacts on ocean hazards and so on. The ocean plays a central role in the interconnected Earth system, which controls planetary climate and habitability, and ocean processes play an important role in climate change, whilst changes in the climate system obviously can have a direct impact on marine productivity, biodiversity, and so on. This is really summed up by this diagram from the IPCC SROT report, where we see many of these interactions and impacts of climate change on various aspects of marine ecosystems and the human sort of socio-ecological system of the ocean. So the key questions that kind of came out of the SRF on climate included: will the ocean continue to take up a significant amount of anthropogenic heat and carbon? How can we detect and attribute climate change impacts on the ocean beyond natural variability? How can we better constrain tipping points over multiple timescales? How do we use the ocean to support the pathway to net zero safely, e.g. through marine carbon dioxide removal? How did the ocean modulate climate change through the Earth's history? How will sea level change in the next decade? And how will climate change affect marine food security? So analysing all this, we actually looked at what types of observations were required in this field, and that included obviously a potential expansion in the use of autonomous platforms. And by these platforms, we really are looking at the wide range of platforms, so everything from gliders, autonomous surface vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, Argo floats, buoys, moorings, and tide gauges. Observing remote ecosystems was felt to be very important, particularly the cryosphere via polar systems and the deep sea. It was felt that it was important to maintain repeat hydrographic sections and kind of permanent ocean observatories, 26 North, the Ellet Line, etc. But it was likely autonomy would increasingly replace ship-based sections in some of these cases. It was also thought to be very important that we maintain experimental studies. So, for example, ship-based studies of ingestion and grazing in terms of plankton communities, fluxes of essential ocean variables, and so on. And in some cases, we really needed to look at intense measurement of multiple variables in a single location over a sustained period, or to look at complex multi-platform experiments. The ability to develop new technologies, new sensors to make measurements that presently we can't make, for example, for new essential ocean variables such as trace metals, particle sized optical properties, and so on, was felt to be important. So sensor development was really looked at as one of the key areas to expand ocean observations. The other thing in the context of climate change was actually also looking at the reconstruction of past ocean state and rate variables, which of course requires the application of proxies to understand how the climate system can vary, and really to deliver constraints to the ocean system models that we use for climate prediction. These proxies require the return of physical samples, so things like sediment cores and rock samples from the ocean, and analysis in terms of state-of-the-art shore-based geochemical facilities such as the Boscore facility and the Diamond Light Source. And of course, empirical calibration is required through measurements of present-day state and rate variables. Moving on to the next grand challenge, and this was protecting biodiversity and ocean health. And of course, biodiversity being the variety of life from genes to ecosystems, and bearing in mind that global biodiversity loss is part of the triple planetary crisis that we're facing. So this really ran from really fundamental biodiversity science, so how life is distributed in the ocean, how it maintains ecosystem function, and how these underpin human society. But obviously, biodiversity is a very challenging science in terms of observation and monitoring of marine biodiversity over the full taxonomic size, spatial and temporal ranges needed to study life in the ocean. And the diagram here just looks at the range of different human activities which impact biodiversity in the ocean. Obviously, for some groups of organisms, fisheries, overexploitation and bycatch are the major drivers of decline in species, but in other groups, such as for aquatic birds, for example, there are other areas which are causing decline, for example, invasive species. So key questions here were really fundamental questions on biodiversity, ecosystem function, and biodiversity loss. The improvement in terms of use of biological health indicators, genomic and evolutionary mechanisms behind adaptation to environmental variability and long-term change. How resilient is biodiversity to environmental change and human pressures? How to predict ecological tipping points or regime shifts? What are the main threats to biodiversity regionally and globally? What types of conservation measures are effective? How can they be designed to adapt to the influence of climate change? And how do we effectively restore and/or rehabilitate marine ecosystems? Again, what came through very strongly here was that sampling of organisms is still essential, but there is an increasing use of autonomous platforms for observations of megafauna and habitat. So, for example, the use of auto subs with video cameras to survey seafloor habitats. We need to maintain long-term, large-scale biodiversity monitoring programs, and in particular, we point to the continuous plankton recorder survey, which has delivered really important results in terms of climate impacts on ecosystems, particularly in the North Atlantic, but also elsewhere. The Porcupine Abyssal Plain Observatory and the Western Channel Observatory as well. One thing that came through here as well, and something which really runs through all of the grand challenges, is the importance of understanding the physical and biogeochemical drivers of species and community distribution in the ocean. So an overriding need to measure essential ocean variables. We're seeing an increasing importance of eDNA and genomic approaches to studying biodiversity, and also the use of machine learning, computer vision approaches for image analysis of environmental data, video data, acoustic data, and so on, but also actually applying computer vision to speed up the sorting and identification of samples in the lab. And then something which I think has generally not been paid sufficient heed to in documents like this in the past in the UK is the use of easy to deploy technologies and alternative technologies like animal tags to use not only derive new knowledge on how large megafauna, for example, use the environment, but also to use these animals as oceanographers. The use of things like hydrophones, baited remote underwater video, scuba diving, survey technologies, and so on. One thing which did come through was perhaps the suggestion that we should develop a biodiversity hub as a kind of centre of excellence in the UK in this kind of hub and spoke arrangement. So essentially have a centre, but one which links out to a variety of UK HEIs and institutions which offer particular expertise in particular areas of biodiversity research. This needn't be a physical thing, but could be a virtual hub. We also pointed out that the BBNJ agreement will demand more systematic documentation and storage of biological material from areas beyond national jurisdiction, and of course the really important role of biological collections such as those hosted at the NHM and Discovery collections for biodiversity work. Moving on to the grand challenge on marine pollution and its sources, distribution and solutions. Obviously, this is the third of the triple crises facing the ocean. We're dealing with multiple interlinked anthropogenic activities, including economic growth, industrialization, and unsustainable consumerism among our societies. Key contributors to pollution include agriculture, manufacturing, shipping, and resource extraction. The villains in this piece include plastics, heavy metals, excess nutrients from fertilizers, hydrocarbons, things like persistent organic pollutants and wastewater. And just to note, much of this pollution originates from land. It was thought that it's really crucial to establish an integrated approach to management in the coastal zone in the context of pollution, and also that education, public awareness raising, and much more collaboration with industry were important features of this and other challenges. Key questions on marine pollution were around the toxicity and ecological impact in multi-stressor systems, including long-term effects of these pollutants on resilience and transgenerational effects, to assess hotspots of ecological, human, and societal risk, pollutant pathways and fates to assess states and trends, to really identify common criteria-based approaches to understanding the impacts of marine pollution and how to tackle the problem, how to evaluate the efficacy of measures to address pollution, and really addressing the many knowledge gaps and enabling access to data on marine pollution in general terms. Again, there were many kind of requirements around this type of research. So improved technology for in situ sampling, the use of autonomous platforms and remote sensing to look at different forms of pollution. And again, the importance of measuring EOVs. Improved real-time sensors for pollutants. So again, sensors are coming through as very important, but also the use of experimental and observational approaches to really understand the impact of pollution on aquatic life. So things like in situ samplers for sediment water interactions and for sediments, the use of mesocosms to look at the effects of some of these materials, and really to look at development of standardized approaches through ecotoxicology infrastructures in land-based laboratories. And finally, the need for modeling of the interaction of these pollutants with ecosystems, and as I've already mentioned, standardization of methodologies. The grand challenge in terms of hazards and extreme events really looks at a whole range of different types of hazards. So biogeochemical, climate and meteo hazards, geological hazards, direct human impacts, and biological hazards such as harmful algal blooms. Key questions here were around the identification of multi-hazards and extreme events, getting better understanding of really the underlying processes behind these hazards, so we could better understand timing and frequency of these extreme events, the resilience of ecosystems and society to these hazards, and the importance of understanding baselines, so the impacts of hazard events could be accurately measured and monitored. Again, the infrastructure here, or the scientific needs ranged across, again, autonomous approaches and remote sensing. Again, with the need for looking at EOVs, ship-based sampling was viewed as extremely important for obtaining samples such as sediment cores, rock material, seismic surveys, sampling of biological communities, and so on. Geological and geophysical characterization of the seafloor and subsurface are very important in the context of some of these hazards. New technologies such as the use of distributed acoustic sensing via telecommunications cables are viewed as important in this context. And in situ observations of waves, tides, storm surges and changes in seafloor and coastal morphology during extreme events is very important in terms of impacts on coastal communities, improved modelling capabilities, and again, the need for land-based facilities for storage and analysis of physical samples. And finally, the grand challenge on sustainable blue economy and ecosystem services. This really concerns the use of ocean space and its resources as an essential component of global economic growth and prosperity. So the blue economy, as I mentioned before, and really looking at ways to actually decouple socio-economic development and direct and indirect environmental degradation. Really trying to develop the blue economy in terms of provisioning and non-provisioning ecosystem services without depleting the natural capital on which they depend. So again, harking back to the Dasgupta report of 2021. And just a few statistics here, which I'm sure we're all familiar with in terms of the reliance on the ocean for food security, economic activity, employment, and so on. Really, knowledge requirements around sustainable blue economy come down to two main areas. One is the knowledge required by society to ensure that industries within the blue economy do not deplete or negatively impact the natural capital on which they and a range of other stakeholders depend. So monitoring impacts of ocean industries, feeding back data to regulators at meaningful timescales that enable responses and policy adjustments and so on. And then the knowledge required by investors and the industries themselves to try and ensure that they meet societal requirements for sustainability across the three major pillars of these being economically sustainable, but also working positively for society and the environment. So this is all about positive benefit these industries, but in the context of minimizing risks. And therefore, it's very, very important to work with industry and access data from industry in this area. So key questions were around future-proofing infrastructure and industry against climate change. So dynamic marine spatial planning, how to build multi-use and complementary infrastructure, cumulative effects of multiple activities to advise on effective policy management, safe and effective CO2 storage and MCDR as particular topics of priority, and increasing the sustainability of aquaculture, and then building a unified blue economy through unifying the fragmented approach to research and management of different industry sectors, engagement and education to communicate the impact of policy decisions and management approaches on the environment and society, looking at the trade-offs between food production systems and ecosystem services, and improved fishing technologies and practices to increase sustainability. This particular grand challenge definitely had a coastal and shelf seas focus. We think the expanded use of autonomous platforms is particularly important here, along with remote sensing. The development of new sensors again comes to the fore, expansion of ships of opportunity, but also opening up the use of industrial infrastructure to collect data, and then the tracking of megafauna to avoid impacts which degrade populations of these organisms across multiple sectors, with data flowing to management of these activities in the ocean. So that was the grand challenges. Following that, in the SRF, we look at cross-cutting themes across all of those areas. I'm not going to go into these in depth, but rather to list them. These are around advancing understanding of the broader system, and in particular, the atmosphere and ocean interface, looking at the evolution of the oceanic lithosphere, the coastal zone to shelf and to open ocean interface, interactions with ice shelves and sea ice dynamics, multiple stressors and intersecting drivers of change, some of these really difficult areas to investigate, observational and process scales, multidisciplinary systems science, and holistic approaches to how we do our science, and then ecosystem connectivity. Something which came through very, very strongly across all of the grand challenges was the critical need for transformation of digital infrastructure, which is really required, so that expanded autonomous capability and the use of tools such as computer vision, eDNA approaches, and so on, which are all going to generate vastly more data than we receive at present, essentially so that we can actually handle these data flows, we can store the data, we can curate those data through appropriate metadata structures, we can make those data accessible and easily accessible for stakeholders, including scientists, but obviously also managers, society, policymakers, and so on. And really, we should be moving towards systems where data and metadata are available via standards-based secured application processing interfaces. Really, the interfaces between different softwares so that these data can be handled at machine speeds to really deliver the optimal outcomes of all these ocean observations that we're making. Digital twins, advanced models are part of this transformation, the development of AI-ready data sets, and really this all flowing back into operational and mission planning so that, for example, we can have a range of different platforms in the ocean actually responding in real time or near real time to changing ocean conditions to measure the phenomena that we want to measure and observe. Along with this digital transformation and this adoption of wider types of autonomous technology in different sensors, it is really critical that we develop capacity to take advantage of these new capabilities. And the important thing to note here is that we're really demanding capacity in areas where there is already competition for skills with industry. So we need a coordinated approach in educating and training the marine scientists of the future to be conversant with digital tools, the use of a range of technologies, and multidisciplinary approaches to science. And this will also need the upskilling and training of existing scientists at marine institutes and HEIs to enable their participation in the use of these tools. And it's important to point out that while scientists may still have their core expertise, they really will need to be conversant with other branches of science and social sciences and the humanities. So this is just a diagram which kind of sums up the science priorities which come through from the SRF, the kind of final chapter of the document. So really moving more from simply observing the ocean to properly understanding the processes underlying how the ocean responds to the changes we're seeing, expanding ocean observation, both in scope and resolution, enhancing the coverage of remote environments such as ice and deep sea, studying past ocean conditions, measuring and linking dynamic processes, and really developing advanced analysis tools through this digital transformation. And then in terms of recommendations and priorities for infrastructure and capability, there is a strong recommendation to maintain a versatile infrastructure. Clearly, the adoption of new technologies is on the table. So autonomous technologies and sensors come through very strongly, but also things like standardized laboratories to ensure that we maintain shore-based infrastructures and so on. Accelerating the digital transformation is a critical component, an integral component to this. Partnership with industry comes through very strongly. Development of national hubs and networks of expertise did not only come through for biodiversity, but for others of the grand challenges as well. And then really building skills for the future. So with that, thank you all for listening, and we'll move to the questions component of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Alex, for